Okay, so we're going to go ahead and get started because we're about 5 after, and we're going to be short on time probably, as always. So I'll just go ahead and introduce myself for those of you that I haven't had a chance to meet. I'm Drew Schrader. I'm one of the school development coaches with the New Tech Network. And Rick can introduce himself. He's co-facilitating with me.
I'm Rick Lear. I'm the senior director for school design and implementation, which means all the professional development events, coaching, so on. So I'm a colleague of Drew's.
So this session specifically is kind of trying to echo several of the larger summit themes around this idea of facilitating inquiry. And for those of you that maybe need a little bit of a data break, it's not going to be as data focused. You can take a little, sometimes I need a little time to step back from data and think more largely about the processes that go into facilitating inquiry. So I think you'll see a lot of similar things from that, but maybe looking at some of the other practices that go around that element of leadership around facilitating for inquiry. Rick and I really wanted to make sure that we got to work with people right after lunch, because we know that like this is everybody's peak energy time. We know that like this is really when you're kind of most plugged in. It's so we want to do to kind of start off, and I know that this will be a little hard to read. So the PowerPoint is also in the briefcase for the course, but I want you to take a minute and just read this quote, and then once you've read it, I actually want you to just stand up and mingle. Somebody define mingle for me. People, I know that Ken Robinson said we don't, as educators, don't get invited to cocktail parties, but maybe some of you might disagree. So if you mingle, what do you do? Get up and talk? Chat? You talk to just kind of one person the whole time? Kind of mix it up. So we're only going to take a couple, 4 or 5 minutes at this, but I want you to just read this. Just think about what is your initial reaction to this quote. And then once you're ready, get up. Find somebody maybe that you haven't had a chance to talk to yet, somebody that you haven't connected with, and just kind of introduce yourselves, mingle a little, share your reactions, and then switch it up and find somebody else. Everybody good on that? All right. Hey, how are you? I'm good. I'm Drew. I don't know if we've had a chance to meet.
Nice to meet you. Jose Suarez. You visited our school.
You go right ahead. Okay. Find a way to wrap up your conversation, and you can cycle back to where you're sitting. So wrap up where you're at, find a way to wrap up where you're at, and you can kind of sit yourselves back down. So find a way to wrap up, and wrapping up and sitting down. I'm just gonna walk around. We're gonna wrap up, and we're gonna sit down.
Okay, Drew.
We're gonna wrap up and sit down. So I can't yell over the top. So we're gonna try to wrap up and sit down. Yeah. Good. Well, I feel like if nothing else, sort of the overall energy and levity in the room is up a little bit. So I'm curious what kinds of things people found themselves talking about. Besides where the martinis are going to be. What? Ask Bob.
We do judge ourselves by how much content we get through.
Mm-hmm.
And I think sometimes that's part of our nature as educators.
Mm-hmm.
We've been given this set amount of material that we're responsible for, and whether it's by our choice or if it's state mandated or federally mandated, we've got to make sure they get to this. And so it's having that mind shift of it's not so much about do I check off the list and get all the pieces, but did I put it together well enough for that to be the piece?
Absolutely. I mean, I think to your point, we're always kind of reconciling these tensions about sort of, I think for most of us, why we got into education, why we're passionate about a model of learning and teaching like this, with what are the external pressures sometimes are sort of trying to shift us to do. And, you know, we can have some hopes around maybe the way that Common Core and some of the other things coming down the pipe that might be moving in alignment with that. But I think you're right, that tension is sort of always there. Is that what everybody talked about?
Something that Tom and I kind of talked about, we touched on, was the fact that it's not so much about what we want to put in kids' heads, but the way we get kids inspired to put things in themselves. And not just, we're going to keep doling out the content and you're going to keep taking it, but inspiring them to be the ones that want to. I mean, everybody probably has something about nurturing lifelong learners in their vision statement, their mission statement, but we don't do that. Unfortunately, we spend too much time, well, we've got to get through these 12 concepts today. And kids aren't inspired to really take hold of that themselves and take it to them.
So if I kind of hear you right, you're kind of saying like you guys kind of gravitated toward that word engagement and this idea that it's not just kind of putting things in kids' heads, but really sort of how do we kind of lift them up into asking some of those questions or sort of pursuing their own passions themselves. Did other people find themselves talking about that?
It constantly keeps you on your toes. You better be ready because you have to keep them engaged.
Mm-hmm.
You know, I love safety documents, and that's one thing. I want them from the very second.
Absolutely. Just something that I would want to name that, Andra, as we go through this, there are going to be several places where I really am going to need you to draw on your prior knowledge and experience with things like entry events as you think about your work with adults. I just want to thank you for kind of naming that really concrete practice that we have around stimulating inquiry and just draw on those kinds of experiences throughout the session as we go along with that. Did anybody, go ahead, Jake.
So a couple of our conversations was, you're going to pick those standards that are important, but, the guy said, teach the heck out of them, teach the heck out of those, and and hopefully that we're part of this discussion of if this is the right thing to do, but find those things that are most important and teach the heck out of them. I really like that.
Absolutely. I mean, so I will admit, and kind of in selecting this quote, and it's worth, I think it's worth noting, the emphasis is not added by me. That actually, that's author's emphasis, kind of that engagement with ideas. And it's interesting, and I was talking with Rick about this during the shuffle. I actually kind of skipped through the word engagement. Because I found myself thinking a lot about the piece with ideas. And so kind of I think to Jake, to what you're saying is that we do at some point, especially in a model like this, have to kind of grab content that we feel like is vital and really kind of push into the ideas with that. Did anyone kind of find themselves talking about that, especially maybe some of the things that the quote's getting at in the second part?
I think part of the step back from engagement is not that engagement doesn't have to be look, loud, and active. Engagement also means reflection and wrestling with. So setting up scaffolding to grow that, I think is really important to be authentically engaged with an idea.
Absolutely.
Where I went when I looked at that, at the italicized fostering students' engagement with ideas, was to our tagline. So if you've been in New Tech for more than 5 minutes, you know that teaching then engages is part of our tagline. But I wondered about just kind of what you were raising. When we think about engaging and engagement, is it always about kids doing something, or does having with ideas tacked on change the way you think at all about engaging and engagement? And I wondered whether that came up for people.
Trying to cover content and get through chapter 25 in the book, and people freak out about all that stuff. And this is our third year in the New Tech Network, and our teachers are saying they're seeing the retention levels of the students, the information that they remember from 3 years ago. They can't believe that. They say, usually you bring up another time, you do it a junior year and have to reteach stuff from 9th grade because they learned it in the moment, took a test, and moved on. So they're really, how do we get people to think about the power standards and what they need to be teaching, but get them to be able to think. Knowledge now, we can go and say, who was the 16th president, look it up on Google, and those type of things. But we want to know, what, because of Abraham Lincoln's presidency, how is our world different today, where they can actually synthesize and think about these things on a deeper level, become thinkers, as you're saying. And so I think the teachers, as they go through the process, they're seeing it being powerful that, they didn't get through all of this information in, whatever chapter this was, but that what they did, the students actually learned. They're actually engaged with it, they apply the learning. And I think that's where you have the most power with the teachers, and then going away from that mindset of covering all these chapters.
And to kind of pick up a thread that I think is now sort of emerging is, in this session, our primary lens is not the teaching that we do with students, it's the teaching that we do with adults, or the learning that we do together with adults, right? That's why we're here together for these couple of days, is to talk about how do we help our schools come together to function as a learning organization. And so I would posit that in a similar way to kind of coverage pressure with that our teachers feel with our students, when we start to think about all the possible things our teachers might need to grow in their inquiry-driven, project-based learning strategies, we might feel a similar pressure around coverage in this role. And to kind of continue the theme that I'm kind of hearing here, ostensibly this session is really going to be about thinking. And it's going to be about the kinds of thinking that we want to engage our teachers with. So as a transition and thinking about this idea of engaging people with ideas, just at your tables, I want you just to think about what are the ideas that you want to engage your teachers with? In other words, what do you want your teachers thinking about? Go, table level.
You know, the starting point might be, what do you want to be thinking about when you're in your school? You and your colleagues. So it's not something you do to, but do with.
That idea that there was that silence. I'm gonna move this thing before you trip over it. Do you mind if I put this up here? Sure. I'm imagining Drew just toppling over backwards while he's walking backwards sometimes. Thank you. No matter what we do, how do we teach them how to do it? Because our culture doesn't really reflect our culture. We're as a melon, we're the culture. If something sits and thinks,
Okay, so we're gonna, I realize that this was a short version for this conversation, but you'll have more time to talk with each other about this. But if we kind of bring this back together, two observations that I would share just as I had a chance, just as kind of we had a chance to watch this. Two observations. One would be that after the initial prompt, there was a significant period of silence. And I think that if you were to ask a similar to question of your teachers, in other words, what is the thinking you want to have your students doing in your class, you might have a similar level of silence. Because I don't know how often we get really detailed in thinking about what is the actual thinking that we want to be engaging our teachers with, or that we want to be engaging kind of the people that we're working with. And it takes some, because what I also heard is I heard a mix of people talking about specific thinking pieces, like thinking about the way that choice might impact the way a student would sort of perceive the content in a project. But I also heard a lot of talk about behaviors and actions, which are certainly connected to thoughts and connected to beliefs, but it's different from really thinking about or really getting clear about what is it that we want the adults in our building to be thinking about. And so to kind of model something or and I'll realize that that's horrible slide design and it's probably too hard for you to read. The next one will blow this up a little bit. To kind of try to connect with what you saw in the anchor session this morning, our theory of action around this particular workshop is specifically about the importance of engaging people and ideas. And our sense of this is that if we want to engage adults in inquiry about their practice, if that's what we want to do, which is the title of this session, so I hope that's what we want to do. If that's something we want to do, we actually have to be clear first about what kind of thinking we want them to do. And if we want to be clear, and then so with that, if we're clear about the thinking that we want them to do, then we'll be in a better position to support those inquiry practices. And if we're able to actually engage those adults in those inquiry practices, then we're going to start developing a better collective understanding of instructional practice. And if we do that, it'll start happening for students. So that's sort of our theory of action on this. I will say today, all we're going to do are these first two. We're going to try to link these first two things today in this session. What we're going to do is really think about getting clear about what is it that we actually want the adults in our building thinking about. And once we start to get clear on that, how do we go about creating experiences that engage them in inquiry around those ideas? Thoughts on that, or kind of just quick responses? We all okay with that sort of as our general direction? So I'll say, just for what it's worth, a lot of the kind of The thoughts around this session came out of this book about making thinking visible, which is one that I sort of picked up this summer. And especially as we've moved into more of our work around college-ready assessments and really getting into the thinking work of the discipline, this text has been just really influential for me. And it's really kind of starting to push a lot of my thinking. And in a couple of key ways that I think connect with what we're all here doing in Detroit this week. One is that we're talking about this idea of creating a learning organization. And I think that in a lot of ways, what we're talking about with a learning organization is also creating a culture of thinking. And in this book, they talk a lot, and this comes out of the folks at Harvard Project Zero, or the Harvard Zero Project.
Project Zero.
Project Zero at Harvard. That's what, yeah. So it sort of comes out of that work, and they kind of have a lot of thoughts about this idea of how do I create a culture of thinking on our campuses? How do we create a space where thinking is something that is explicitly given time and shown that we have value around that? Some other kind of just related ideas that we sort of hope to sort of emphasize kind of in this session is this idea that thinking needs to be visible, right? And this is one that I've actually probably spoken to you about, some of you about this, but one of the things, being somebody who taught in the humanities, and they stress in our methods classes how important it is to model, 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 right? Reading is an invisible practice that happens in your head, and if you're not modeling think alouds, kids will never see how to do it, right? That in order to help kids, I need to make my thinking visible for them, right? What this book really has pushed me on is that that's absolutely true, but the reverse might even be more true. That it's vital that I make my thinking visible to my students so they see what expert habits of thinking look like, but it's probably more effective if I can get them to make their thinking visible to me. Because then I can get in and engage, and I can help course correct, and I can help actually engage with them on their terms. Instead of just asking them to get what's in my head in theirs, I can get in their head and help guide them to a different place, or help them see something that they're not seeing yet. So I feel like that's one of kind of the ideas behind how we start to make a culture of thinking in our schools. Also just this other piece, and this came up kind of in some of the sessions yesterday, but just this idea that if we're going to be about creating inquiry in our schools, that ultimately inquiry is about listening. And this idea that to really have an experience where you're really hearing people, and in fact, I kind of found this quote that I feel like really sort of emphasizes this. This idea that listening isn't just me not talking, though most of the time I can't even manage that. But that listening is actually taking this kind of human interest in what somebody else is saying. And so one of the things, and I kind of emphasize this, because to the quote down here at the bottom, this idea that when we really listen, we show that we value thinking, and that creates a space where people are going to be more willing to do it. So as we think about guiding our fellow learners, our fellow adults in the building, we have to create this space where we're genuinely listening to what they're saying, because it actually is going to help make them feel like their thinking is valued, because it is. So as we go through this, I want us to really try to stress in a lot of these table level conversations, try to stress that first part. When somebody else is talking, try to go one step beyond just not talking. I don't know about you, but I'm one of those people that's always formulating what I'm going to say in response when somebody else is talking, and I realize midway through, oh crap, I stopped listening because it was all about me and what I was about to say.
And actually, often it's not formulating a response, it's thinking about what I want to say. It'll be more clever or more insightful. It isn't even necessarily responsive. It's just my turn's coming, what am I going to say?
Right. And as a way of making this a little more concrete, I want to name a practice that gets called out in that book as one of these routines that you might do around thinking, this idea of a reflective toss, right? Then that's for all of the baseball fans out here to think about this. But this idea that when someone else is speaking, part of one of the best things that you can do to help guide their thinking is simply gather in what they've said and toss it back to them with a question or a prompt that might help them take their thinking just a little bit further. A lot of you, I think, accuse NTN coaches of doing this, that you may recognize this strategy. You know, what I hear you saying is, could you tell me more about? Right, but it's this process of getting your thinking visible. It's the process of how do we get the conversation on what we're thinking kind of out in the air. So as we go through this, want to kind of really emphasize, and if nothing else happens in this session, I think if we walk away getting some really good practice around deep listening skills, I think we'll go back better able to engage in inquiry with our staffs. So we're about to get into something kind of more active with this. So in the Visible Thinking book, part of what they do to help encourage this culture of thinking is they take people through routines. And essentially you can, routines function really similar to protocols, but it's simply kind of habits of conversing with one another in ways that make thinking really visible. So part of what we're going to do in this is we're going to go through a modified version of this claim support question routine. So in this idea, basically, the way the routine works is, it's fairly straightforward, right? You have a common text or a common experience, you make a claim about it that you should support, and then then you ask questions about it. Other people can question it, you can kind of question it for yourself. And we're going to do this, since we're thinking about task design, we're going to do this kind of specifically looking at the lens of our project planning toolkit. So on the tables in front of you, you've got a sheet which is the first page of the project planning toolkit, our training version. So we've actually got we'll have to probably hand out a few more copies at a few tables, but everybody needs sort of a copy of this.
Let me know if you need a copy.
Yep. Yeah. So this is facilitated. It's in the facilitating inquiry section of the breakout session.
We need a couple more.
You need a couple more.
Got 'em.
Anybody else need more? You guys probably need some more back here. Does everybody have one of these?
Sorry, I'm just reaching right over you. My apologies. Yep.
Okay. So
There you go. You're good. Okay. Oh, thanks.
as kind of a point of practice on this, so one of the things that we're trying to do to keep our kind of current thinking around project design out in front of schools is kind of working through this idea of a planning toolkit. And we have a training version, and so this comes from the version that we use in our new schools training. And we know that teachers, and there are several other pages that go along with this. They're all linked in the briefcase if you want to see that. You won't need it for this activity. What we know is that teachers can't or won't go through that process of going through that entire planning toolkit every time they design a project, right? It's designed to be a scaffold to help lift people to the point where they can design projects, and then they start to set that aside and use some of their own processes. We also have a version of the toolkit in the project briefcase. So when you copy that briefcase template down in Echo, the benchmark version of the briefcase, there's a version of the planning toolkit in there, and our hope with that is that teachers would actually use that as a mental checklist every single time they design a project. It's a slim, scaled-down version of this more robust tool, and the idea is just by going through that regular process, this will help teachers kind of fill in all the cracks in their project design. It's also the place where, as our understanding and our tools continue to develop, we're trying to push those out through the toolkit. So you can also feel relatively assured that if you're working through the toolkit, you're accessing kind of the most current documents and resources we have. So that's just sort of a side point on that. For the protocol on this, what we want you to do is start off, and I want you just to take a couple of minutes and take the perspective of the discipline that you taught. And if that doesn't quite work for you, think about, or that you taught or that you currently teach, or a subject area, a particular discipline that you'd like to support a teacher in. I want you just to work through the toolkit and think about what are each of these different prompts asking you to think about in order to answer that. In other words, what type of thinking do you have to do in order to answer that question? Does that make sense? We're going to give you like 4 or 5 minutes to do this, and these are going to be this is going to be the foundation for your claims in your table level discussion. So we'll give you a few minutes to do that. If you have questions, Rick and I are around and we can kind of help you with that. But take just a few minutes just to read this to yourselves. Yeah. Let's just kind of pause for a second on this and just sort of see how we're doing, because I think this is a challenging thing to think about, right? And I think I'm hearing kind of some kind of confusion about sort of what do we mean by kinds of thinking. Does anyone feel like they sort of kind of have a thought about that? Anyone feel like they've sort of got some things in mind? Go ahead.
Well, when I'm thinking of it through the lens of science and the idea of, say, water quality, but the kind of thinking is to imagine putting myself or the student through the task the way a scientist would think about a problem they had to face. So how would they approach the problem through the kinds of questions they would ask, the kinds of resources they would go to understand the problem. So it would be a sort of a critical thinking process that they go through, and that I would want to take the students. I don't know if that answers your question.
Yeah, great. And which question, when you were looking at that, like which question on there sort of prompted that?
Well, what big ideas of the discipline will students tackle, and what type of authentic task will you engage them in? So
right.
I was thinking of the task and how I'd have to develop an understanding of the inquiry process, because that's what the scientists would do in that site at that moment.
Great. So did everyone just to kind of hear that? So in that first seemingly very simple question, right? What big ideas of the discipline will this project cover? in order for a teacher to really answer that question, what are all of the things that they actually have to think about? What are the big ideas of my discipline? What does it look like when a scientists begin to answer these questions? What are the types of questions? So we begin to answer kinds of questions like, what does my discipline look like? How do I prioritize those kinds of things? You know, we talked about find the standards you got to do and hit them hard, right? They have to be doing that kind of thinking, right? They have to be thinking about disciplinary literacy or even thinking about sort of disciplinary practices. What is it that scientists do? What is it that historians actually do to get at those big ideas? You had your hand.
Yeah, I was coming at it from a math perspective, and similar to those thoughts, where it forced me to think, what are really understanding a project from a child's perspective, a student's perspective, in a sense of how are we still getting them to these rigorous standards, and how are we engaging them along the way, but to really take the teacher side out of it in a lot of ways and really think through how is this going to be best for our students.
Can I ask, that's fantastic. Which part of the toolkit actually prompted you to have that thinking?
Just the idea, the second one was a big one for me. What type of authentic tasks will students engage in to deepen their understanding of the discipline?
Great. So that question around the authentic task to engage students forces, the thinking you have to start to do as a teacher in that area is, okay, if I'm a student, I have to kind of put myself in that student perspective. What's the kind of task or what's the kind of thing that's going to get me into those? So if I've identified the ideas in the first question, now I'm aware of what they are. Okay, now I have to think about how do I take a 15-year-old and get them to see the value in engaging in those ideas?
So what you said is I have to get out of my teacher's head into kids. I have a different perspective. I think what you do when you to do that, you draw on all that you know as a trained professional about developmental nature of adolescence and the particular 15-year-old kids you have, not the ones in some other town or in some other community. You're drawing on deep knowledge that you have as an adult. Because in fact, most kids can't say for themselves what they need.
Right,
And
and you also are knowing where they need to be for their standards.
Exactly.
But
Right.
for me, it also, it doesn't take you out of it, but it helps me control it.
It shows you how to get in it,
Yeah.
in a way. Yeah. But you're drawing on really pretty specialized knowledge, in fact, to be able to do that. Yeah. And it doesn't. We'll in a few weeks we'll have a video out about where a history teacher and a science teacher who teach an integrated course talk about the nature of evidence in their disciplines and how shockingly different it is about what they will accept and how that affects their thinking together. So it isn't how you think, what you accept as evidence or even what you generate as hypotheses are quite different depending on your disciplines. And that's critical to development for kids, that they over time can see that. So that might be a critical idea as a school that you might want to talk about. How do kids understand the nature of our disciplines and where they're similar and where they're different? What transfers, what doesn't? Those kinds of things.
We discussed a little bit that we felt like part of 3 had to come before part 1. And you know targeted skills before you can think about big ideas. You know, not that we're changing all this, but I mean, not that it has to go sequentially, but you have to know a little bit of 3 before you can even go that direction with big ideas.
Great, so it's a real practical insight into also, if these are the tools that are out there for your teachers to lean on to design quality projects, also helping them think metacognitively about how to use the tool. You don't have to use the tool in order, right? They're just listed in order because there's a certain logic to that, but to your point, you may actually need to think about which of these questions needs to come prior to another. How are people feeling now about this question about what kind of thinking is this tool asking your teachers to do?
I think you need to think about it more and then talk about it. So have at it.
Good call. So let's do this. So the next step in this, you've had a little chance on this, and we'll do sort of an abbreviated version. But what we'd like you to do, just sort of at your table level groups, is to look at. Again, I would encourage you to really kind of try to draw on particular elements in the toolkit one, to just model this idea of drawing on clear support and kind of on clear evidence, but also to help to sort of deepen your own familiarity with some of the different tools. But just have one or two people, because that's probably all we'll have time for, think about a claim related to the thinking that toolkit is asking you to do. So make kind of a claim about, this prompt here seems to be asking teachers to do this kind of thinking, and talk about what your support for that is in the same way that I think several people just modeled. And then to help us kind of continue to engage with this, asking some questions about that of each other. So don't feel like you need to immediately move on to the next one. And so it's not about getting a laundry list of things to think about out, but maybe we'll just take one or two and go fairly deep into that and ask about, ask some of those reflective questions. Maybe practice that reflective toss. What makes you say that? So this piece around getting inside the mind of a student, pushing that a little bit further to sort of see what we learn about that. That sound good? So we're going to actually go through it. So this is actually engaging in one of those thinking routines. So we'll try to get somebody to make a claim and support that claim with some evidence, and then that person or others at the table can kind of question that claim a little bit and try to get at what some of the underlying thinking is.
So I think I would make it, so I think the idea is that there's really explicit thinking that teachers are going to need to do to be successful in working through this. And part of our job as kind of instructional leaders with them is to help create conditions where they can really engage in that kind of thinking. And so not just engage in like task design or not just engage in the right activities, but how do I really think about those developmental milestones that an adolescent might be going through? Or how do I really think about what the work of a scientist actually looks like? That's the real thinking that needs to happen. So what the thought here would be just looking at some of the different questions in there. Just pick one and think about what do you think a teacher has to be thinking about in order to answer that question? What do you need to think about in order to answer that question? That's your claim.
So I might look at how will students practice and demonstrate college and career readiness. So how do I know what those college and career readiness skills are?
Yeah. So it's part of
Or I might say those skills are written communication. That would be my claim.
So it's quite thinking about So the claim would be
The
that.
next question, okay, how are we going to have them demonstrate they have these skills?
Right.
What's that going to look like for this project?
Right.
It's going to be a 3-page paper. Why is it going to be a 3-page paper?
Right.
Should it be 5? Do they need to do any writing at all? Is that in that setting?
Exactly. Exactly.
Is it kind of like just prompting their thinking? Does that make sense?
So this is actually good. So, and this isn't. This is actually us just thinking about what kinds of thinking we want our teachers to engage in. So this isn't like this. This isn't maybe identical to the conversation you would have with a teacher. This is us talking together about if we need a teacher to think about college and career ready skills. Like, what are the actual things that they need to think about? Back to that initial question that we asked: what do we want our teachers thinking about? It's an attempt to kind of get a level clearer or a level more concrete about that. Does that make sense, or does that make things less clear?
I'm getting there. Toss back to the teacher. In order to engage.
Well, so what? I'm sorry.
Is the claim?
The claim is okay. So when I plan a project, I start first with da 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 da, and here's why. That's the claim. Okay. Teachers made that, and here's why I do it.
We're going to look at, we're going to clean up this creek, or he said something about water. Okay, we're going to clean up this creek. And it's a great idea because it's really dirty.
Yeah.
And that's a claim. And I might say, well, how do you know it's dirty?
That's about what they're doing. But ask what's the thinking that led you to that? Why? I mean, we start with the end in mind. My bet is if we poll new tech teachers, say, of these 4, where do you most often start? We probably distribute
I'm going to think about
pretty well
rearranging
across the thing.
my
People,
debrief.
some people,
And I'm
they
curious,
have a great project.
do you
They have
feel
a
like,
culmination
what I'm tempted to do is go
thing
back
in.
to
I
the
want that
question that we
creek
asked at the
clean
beginning
because
about
we
what do we
look
want
at
our teachers
And
thinking
they
about.
start there, and then they build backwards.
Do you feel like
and
you
then
have a
they
different answer
identify
to
the
that
standards that they have
than you
to do
did
and so on, and they connect
30
those
minutes
with the
ago?
ideas. I think it's that. But what's the nature of the
necessarily.
thinking that you go through as a teacher? What do you do? What do you do? Maybe what you do is think about, maybe it's not, maybe it isn't even any of these. Maybe it's what do I think my kids need, and what's my evidence that leads me to believe that? And then how do I move? But the claim is what a teacher is about her own thinking and planning. To try to get them to think about it. As if you were a teacher. As if you were a teacher. So the next session we do this, what we're going to do is ask somebody who's currently a teacher to do this and say, think about the last project or the best project you've done. How did you start to think about that? What was your thinking? What was your process to go through that? And why? And then we'll ask the rest of everybody else to inquire into that, so that both the teachers' thinking can get pushed, and so that you can understand more what it was. Because
the teachers making the claim.
Yes. Teachers making the claim about our own thinking.
About that.
Yeah.
Okay, so
Yeah.
kind of nearing the end of the session time, so I want to just kind of bring this back. And I'm curious, first of all, if anything sort of came up in your group's conversations that sort of kind of sparked an idea for you, or that sort of left you thinking about something new. Sure. So I'm just curious, in your conversations, did anything kind of come up that kind of provided a little new insight or some new clarity around kind of what we've been talking about?
Over here, we were talking about getting from the student's perspective. I think that's the gist.
I think we thought the whole idea of the big ideas, and as a teacher, facilitator, you're coming up with the big ideas, but you have to be able to make a connection from the big idea to what's reality for those students, and find the connection or something authentic that's going to connect them to the big idea, so that you can get your point across as something that's reality to them. You brought up the idea of we're talking about math, and if someone's talking about project over mortgage rates, and you're talking to a 15-year-old, there's probably not going to be much connection because they're not buying a house anytime soon. But there is a connection maybe to cell phone rates or different plans and things of that nature. So what connects them to the big idea, but also is authentic and genuine for that 15-year-old?
And then going further, how do you get to know what authentic, what connection? How are you gonna get down? I guess what does it take, okay, to get to know what's meaningful to the student? How do you get understand what we're gonna do?
Absolutely.
As I was looking at this on number 4, how will students engage in inquiry throughout the phase of the project? I was thinking, okay, how do I take this back to the staff? How will our staff engage in inquiry as they're planning the phases of the project? And so how will we help our facilitators be thinking about how they're going to challenge students to think? So that is a whole another layer to the onion as far as the critical thinking piece goes.
Absolutely, and I think that's where, and as we were doing this, I think I have a new appreciation for just how abstract a question we asked you to engage in as we got into it, because in a lot of ways, if we kind of go back to kind of the theory of action behind this, I think the idea was we need to be really clear for ourselves about if we want to guide and help our teachers deepen their understanding of instruction, we have to be engaging with them around what they're thinking. And if we want to engage with them around what they're thinking, we actually have to think about what do they need to be thinking about. Like, we actually have to have some clear thoughts about, I need my teachers to be thinking about the way I'm going to scaffold these things, the way that I'm going to bridge the gap between my adult experiences and the experiences of a 15-year-old, the kinds of thinking that people do in my discipline, that we need to be really clear for ourselves that that's what we need to develop understanding about. That's what we need to have teachers grapple with, engage with, to really come to an understanding on. And really, most of what we've been doing today is really just that first step is, I hope, and that was the attempt anyway, I'll say. The attempt was to have us think about to get a little clear about what are those things we want teachers thinking about, and then to to kind of that next step there would be to think, if those are the things we want them thinking about, what is it that I can do as somebody who's sort of leading learning in my building? What are the kinds of situations that I can put them in to engage them in those ideas and to really create conditions where I'm not just sort of guiding them towards their next steps, but I'm actually putting them in a situation to grapple with those ideas about development or those ideas about disciplinary literacy or those types of ideas.
Yeah. And along that lines, though, is allowing us to, or giving ourselves, at least in my opinion, giving ourselves permission to remove some of the technical aspects of that from the equation. So giving them the skills that it takes to think through something, the steps of that inquiry, versus letting them try to kind of discover that on their own. You get paralysis. I don't even know how to think about that.
Right.
You know, so teaching them how to think.
Right. And ultimately, how do you teach people how to think? How do you learn to think? Yeah, you have to think, right? So if we want our teachers to improve at their thinking about their practice, we have to get them in situations where they're specifically thinking about what they're doing and they're really kind of grappling with those ideas. And we can give them mental models, so these thinking routines, and there's a bunch of them kind of listed. If you're somebody who likes kind of those clear walkaways or kind of clear takeaways, there are some visible thinking resources that are protocols around grappling with different kinds of questions that are linked in the briefcase for this section. And I'd encourage you to look at those. And if you have more questions about those, kind of follow up with me on that. And I'd be happy to point you towards some of those. But I think that's kind of the direction that we need to go. So. Just really quickly, because I know I want to let you guys go because we've got kind of a break now and some time before your next session. I would ask for kind of either thing right now. One is if anybody just sort of has a takeaway, kind of a walkaway that they have from this session, or if you have a recommendation for the session that's going to happen in about 15 minutes. I'm always very interested in sort of revising.
And then if you want to come back for the third one and see how it's changed.
It sounds like there's some recommendations up here, which I would be really happy. Anybody have kind of a clear kind of a walkaway or something that they're thinking about as a result of their time in here?
It just, coming from a school counselor's perspective, I mean, a lot of this is it's what we learn in school counseling theory.
Interesting. Could you just say just a little more about that? She said that this, as a school counselor, this is just what they learn in school counselor theory. So,
going through, learning how to do counseling, the counseling theory is all about listening and, active listening and how to ask the right questions, to dig deeper, to make people's thinking visible, not only to you, but to themselves, so they have those aha moments. So reading some books, say, by William Glasser, who also, does quality schools, is a great resource for a layman.
Yeah. Absolutely. And I think that's sometimes a nice kind of metaphor to think about sometimes those conversations. It is kind of a counseling role. Like you're kind of having a conversation with people about sort of meaning making out of their situation. All right. Looks like they're on. Did you have any? No. Yeah.
Just one thing. So my teacher and I this past year coached our project, and we started to ask the question, where and what places are we thinking too much for our kids? So in what places are we providing too much information and taking away some critical thinking that they could be doing? So that might be a good starting place for staff, asking them in what places are you thinking too much for your students and not giving them opportunity to think themselves.
Absolutely, and by extension, I would just say, and this kind of even goes back to the question that Tom raised, is as you identify areas of need for your staff, where are you doing the thinking for them, as opposed to creating the conditions where they need to think their way through that problem with your support, and helping them kind of realizing that that's the difference you want them to think about in their class, that I need to give that thinking back over to the students and then help with support. And I think that's the same dynamic that we need to kind of take in relation to our colleagues as we're helping think through different situations. So if you do have other kind of feedback for things that maybe places where this was a struggle or ideas, I would love it if you wanted to tell me those afterwards, but otherwise we'll let you guys go and enjoy the rest of the afternoon.